Hello and welcome to Chatz, the television podcast, Season 11, Part B, Angels in Chatz America. My name is Alan, and I'm joined by my best friend, Magellan.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, welcome to the show, everybody. It's Chatz, a television podcast, the number one cult classic TV show podcast this side of this podcast, specifically. And we're just a couple of TV watchers who love talking about shows, both long and short, both miniature and extensive. And we are continuing
the Spring of Miniseries
with another miniseries. A critically acclaimed one, if you will. We're here to talk about Angels in America, which is a 2003 adaptation of a Tony Kushner play about the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and those who survived it and lived through it. And we watched the first two parts of it today. John, are you excited?
I'm very excited. Excited is an interesting word, but I'm very eager to discuss these episodes.
Are you thrilled? No. The second miniseries that we're discussing for the season of Chatz is Angels in America. It's based on a 1991 play by Tony Kushner, and we are watching the 2003 HBO miniseries version directed by Mike Nichols, the guy who did The Graduate and whatnot. And we're very excited to talk about it. We watched parts 1 and 2 this week. Which are the first two parts of the Millennium Approaches act of the play. And Magellan, if you don't mind, can you give me some summaries for these sections?
Sure. So we watched Millennium Approaches Chapter 1, which is entitled Bad News, and Chapter 2, entitled In Vitro. The summary for Bad News, in this episode, New York City, 1985. A gay couple is rocked by the revelation that one has AIDS. A young man is offered a job by conservative icon Roy Cohn. That's a way to summarize it, I guess. Those summaries come from the HBO website, so that's just how they did it. This is our second time watching Part 1. Folks have heard our pilot chats of it on the main feed and on the Patreon. What did you think overall revisiting this episode? Were there like new thoughts that you had here, or did anything get reframed for you in the second watch? Anything like that?
It's so usually when we rewatch something after piloting it, I look in my second viewing for more production details, such as how certain parts are shot or the way they use music, things like that, because those are things I like to focus on. But usually the first time I'm just trying to absorb storyline, and this is a gorgeously shot miniseries. Mike Nichols has been around in the game for years and years, and it's kind of like you didn't have to go this hard. This is, as an adaptation of play, it doesn't have to be a cinematic masterpiece. It can just be people sitting in rooms and talking to each other. And while it is mostly that, I think they're using little tricks here and there based on who's being focused on and use of zoom and focus like that. It's just really striking for the time, but also specifically in the script. I think this is something you don't get used to if you don't watch a lot of plays, but it's pretty naturalistic the way that these people talk to each other, but there's it's a little bit askew, right? It's not, there's a difference between hyperrealism, which would be filled with ums and uhs, and that's not how any TV or movies are usually written. And then this, which is these are characters who are espousing ideas, just like the rabbi says at the beginning. These aren't characters; these are ideas of people. And I noticed that a lot more in this rewatch of how people talk to each other and don't really sound like single persons, but more sort of sounding boards for ideas and thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a very play-like quality. I was thinking about that too. How what this miniseries possesses in common with a play as opposed to a film is just the ways in which characters move quickly towards speaking the truth about themselves, if that makes sense. This kind of philosophical self-awareness in ways that films more so, like you're saying, are more interested in putting you in the scene or in the place or making it feel naturalistic, or the opposite of that, it's some sort of fantastical thing. But I think what this story does really well is it makes these sort of mundane moments not mundane in like a boring way, but mundane meaning like everyday life, ordinary life, and gives them a fantastical quality that it speaks to certain truths that I think plays are especially good at doing, and we don't really see like television or film speak about things in quite the same way.
Right, and again, these are some part of the appeal of television, cinema, plays, what have you, is that you're getting to see characters act and do things that you've maybe thought of doing or saying, but you've never like outright done. I specifically think about the scene in the bathroom where Lewis and Joe Pitt meet for the first time, and Lewis very quickly realizes that Joe is a closeted gay man and gives him a kiss on the cheek as he leaves, and it feels so real, but also I've never known anyone to even consider doing something like that. And it's like, there's just that sort of 1 degree away from reality charm to this miniseries that I kind of can't get enough of, because it's just very unique in that way, very memorable.
Yeah, definitely.
But we're placed into the lives of 2 couples in this story. We start at a funeral for Lewis's grandmother in a real funeral home, by the way, that is in New York to this day. And he's there with his boyfriend, Prior Walter. And after this very fascinating monologue from a rabbi who we looked up and found out is played by Meryl Streep, New Jersey's own Meryl Streep. Why did I always think she was British? I don't know, but she's totally just,
she's just that good.
Exactly. She's playing a male rabbi and doing this monologue about like, well, I didn't know you're the grandmother very well at all. In fact, I don't know her, but she is an immigrant and she did all this journey to come here. And while we didn't do the journey, we are carrying on her legacy by being here and existing together. And
what did you think about that? Because I think we've said in the pilot, and you were alluding to earlier, that the bit about where the rabbi says she was not a person, but a whole kind of person is kind of setting the tone for how you should think about the characters of this story, not just as individuals, but as whole kinds of people who are living during this epidemic. But then the bit about like, every day that you walk through Flatbush, you're walking along the journey that she's taken. And this conversation about the importance and the beauty of like the immigration story, I'm having a hard time figuring out how that really connects to what comes later. So I'm curious if you had a thought on that.
Yeah, it's one of the things I remember learning in my film class back in college was always think about the first scene of a film, even the first shot, as a guide, as a compass, something to keep in mind the whole time. And even though that scene is strange, especially when you realize what they're doing, like I think something we're going to pick up on more as we see her in the miniseries more is that Meryl Streep's character is this sort of presence that just exists to push people in different directions, right? And think about the set dressing also of that funeral scene. I mean, Prior and Lewis are in the background, are in the back of this church or of temple, I guess. Because they're isolated from the rest of the family. Because presumably everybody knows, or at least has some understanding that this is Lewis's weird friend, and so they're distanced from this. But they're also like, we're cutting to all of the different smiling faces as the rabbi is like, and we are all part of this journey together. Like it is something that's supposed to feel like, oh, we are all children of immigrants. We're all connected by this thought, but at the same time, we are distancing our own family based on their decisions and who they chose to spend their lives with. So there is like an underlying sadness to it, and like there's a private and public life that's on display in this temple scene.
I see. So you're saying that it's kind of, there's meant to be this sort of like dissonance between the stock narratives about like, what brings us together, and then we see what actually is like separating people during this time.
Absolutely. And as somebody who is myself the child of immigrants, I definitely have felt this sentiment before, right? Where a higher figure, be it some sort of adult, is telling everybody, we're all from the same group and we're all from the same family. We all need to like help each other out. But at the same time, there is so much bias and bigotry happening within that feels completely counter to what this message is.
Yeah, and that seems supported by the scene later where Lewis is in the graveyard going to bury his grandmother, and then runs into the rabbi and tries to talk to the rabbi, and the rabbi is like very rude and dismissive of him, and he's like, "What would you say?" Because he's taught. We'll get to this, but we learn that Prior Walter has been diagnosed with HIV. And is starting to show symptoms, and Lewis is freaking out about that and considering leaving him because he's so scared of the disease. So he's talking to the rabbi, and he's like, is there anything in scripture about someone who like abandons somebody else in a time of need? And the rabbi's like, why would anybody do that? Go away. Like, I don't want to talk to you.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that's a scene that I'd kind of ignored in my analysis of the rabbi character, but I think supports what you're saying, that like he'll get up there and give this sort of like beautiful but a little bit empty speech. And then when it comes down to like actually really listening and helping individual people, he's like, I'm an old man. I'm going to carve my onion or whatever I'm doing.
I wondered too what the series is trying to say about Jewish faith leaders also, and like what the role of Judaism is in Angels in America. And I obviously don't have the cultural context for that. I don't think either of us do, but it is core to Lewis's character and his feelings of guilt and regret in his relationship with Prior Walter. But that is something we were also talking about before the podcast or last night about like how would you recast Angels in America? Because something we're going to also get into is the way that this show or this miniseries, despite being about people who are down on their luck and going through societal tragedy, through systemic tragedy, are still relatively well off white people across the board. And while this is the 1980s and these are some of the people who that story is happening to, this is definitely not who the majority of the people that story is happening to. And it feels somewhat deliberate in places, but in other places it feels like they could have just swapped this out and had it feel a lot more accurate and realistic.
Yeah.
And like, what is the value of it being like that? Because they've, with it, this is an adaptation of a play. In that version, you can just cast different people. It's relatively easy and extremely common to cast different people for a play, but with someone like Lewis, his Jewish faith is core to his character. And it's something that comes up a lot, even as we pan into our other plot, with the Roy Cohn and his relationship to the Rosenbergs and his anti-Semitism and all that. So it's kind of all up in there, and you can't just swap out all of the pieces for other pieces, I think. So it's complicated.
Yeah. I think we'll return to that conversation, but I don't want to lose the thread of something that you just brought up about like the idea of faith and like the role of faith leaders or the failure of faith leaders in this particular crisis.
Yeah.
Because I'll be talking about this probably throughout the episode, but I just, before we started, watched this documentary about the organization ACT UP, which was a pretty core AIDS activism group in the 80s and 90s. The documentary is called How to Survive a Plague. And there were a number of, really compelling things that I want to bring into the conversation from that. But one thing that I just thought of is there's this beat in the documentary about the Catholic Church saying like homosexuality is a sin and like using condoms is a sin and all this stuff, and religious organizations being one of the thorns in the side or opponents to addressing the ills of the AIDS epidemic. And what that has me thinking about is like, what is the place of faith in this story? Because at least like religious leaders during this time, quite a portion of them, I would imagine, were conservative and had things to say about homosexuality. And yet this is Angels in America. Like, there is literally an angel character. There is some kind of like cosmic force or some sort of spirituality that textually exists. And so I find that really interesting, that tension between like the the sort of like disdain for religious organizations as they exist, but also this like this need and desire for there to be some kind of faith to rely upon.
Yeah, I mean, Prior Walter, this is something I didn't even bring up in my notes, but he is getting messages and voices in his head from an angel throughout this, talking about things that we haven't even like started to consider, but like a great reckoning is going to come, and you have a sworn duty you have to do, and there is still life ahead for you. Religion is it's on the borders of this entire series in every moment of every scene, pretty much. Even that intro, that stunning intro with I guess it's a helicopter shot. There has to be a little bit of CG in there, by the way, because I don't think it's feasible to like do a full pan into the middle of Central Park. I don't know how they would have choreographed that, but it's possible. Yeah. But then once they get in, it's on an angel statue in the middle of Central Park that like looks towards the camera. And the music kind of does a little sci-fi twist noise, like a and it's like, okay, angels exist, and they're trying to be a lot more level-headed or like even-handed about that than something like, angels in the outfield or other traditional like cinematic portrayals of angels. They exist, but they're not like, we're not going to get like a dude in wings being like, "What's up? I'm an angel," but we kind of are with like.
Well, yeah, I think we are. Also,
well, we haven't gotten it yet, at least. Other than the guy that talks to Harper.
Yeah, and then the other religion angle we'll talk about more probably in the second episode is Harper and Joe's Mormonism. And how that plays into their characters as well. But yeah, should we? I think maybe further set the stage of just like who all the characters are in this.
Yeah.
So we've talked about Lewis and Pryor. So Pryor is diagnosed with AIDS, and they're boyfriends. Lewis is like really freaked out by the prospect of that. And so a lot of their plot in this episode is about him thinking about what does it mean to be with someone through this very scary thing that's also scary for you. Then you have Joe and Harper, who are, as I just said, they're Mormons. Joe is working for Roy Cohn, who's this like conservative political legal character from real life, who we talked about a bit in our pilot, and we'll talk about more. And Joe, we learn, is a closeted gay man. Harper is like learning that as well, but also in denial about it. And she's also struggling with a pill addiction. And then there's Roy Cohn in there doing his Roy Cohn thing. But those are basically the five like main characters that we're following through the course of this story. Yeah.
I found myself, although I love Pryor and Lewis. I think like the scene in the park where Pryor tells Lewis that he has AIDS and talks about being a legionnaire and being part of the Foreign Legion and that whole he's the kind of person who cannot just be like we can't say dark things like this without twisting it with a little bit of comedy or a little bit of like dark comedy. I know plenty of people like that, and it's very affecting. And then also, they're putting a lot on Ben Shankman to have him cry in the first like 10 minutes of this miniseries, and to have this gut wrenching moment so early in our knowledge of these characters. I do think it still works, but it doesn't work to me as well as some of the later emotional beats, because we really need more time to get to know these people. And I remember thinking that during the pilot too, like, oh, I just met these guys, and I'm already like learning that one of them has a death sentence. Like, oh, here we go.
Yeah.
But that's part of the thing about it being a miniseries is they're not going to just sit with these guys forever. There is forward momentum in basically every scene.
Yeah, it definitely, that moment, I connected with those two characters a lot more on the second viewing than the first, I think, because it felt like on my first viewing, very exposition-y what's going on with them, but when I was able to sit with it and I'm like, okay, I know them a little bit better. I know that this conversation is about to happen, and I'm not focused on the information that's coming in, but more focused on like who they are and how they're interacting and reacting to it. I found that scene a lot more compelling because they have this really great exchange where Pryor's talking about how he lost his cat, and Lewis is kind of saying, like, we should have gotten a dog. Like, this is why dogs are better. And there's this line where Pryor's like, or Lewis is like, dogs are as smart as a 2-year-old. And Pryor says, cats have intuition. Cats know when something is wrong, and gives him this look like, something's wrong.
They're not getting it.
I want you to notice it so that I don't have to tell you. Exactly. And then Lewis still just doesn't get it. So he has to pop his shirt open and say, like, here's the lesion. I'm sick. This is what's happening. But without that, like, that's a line that you can only really appreciate when you already understand where it's going to go, I think.
Right. There, and it centers AIDS and illness and tragedy right at the top of the series. You know, we start on a funeral and then we go to someone announcing that they're dying. Like, this is a series that is going to be about this, right? From the top. Do we want to talk more about Lewis and Pryor now, or do we want to pivot to talk a little bit about Joe and Harper? Because I have a lot to say about Joe and Harper.
I think that's as much as we have to say about Lewis and Pryor. Let's just finish that out for the episode. Do you have thoughts on their later scenes? Because I have a couple things.
Yeah, I definitely wanted. I know we mentioned wanting to talk about the conversation they have later in this episode too about Judaism and the difference between judgment and verdict and what it's like. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, so that scene is another scene that I just I wasn't really able to parse or appreciate the first time through. And then the second time I thought a lot more deeply about what was being said there, because the first time through, you're kind of in the position of Pryor. This is later in the episode. Pryor and Lewis are in bed together. And Lewis is talking about, like, the way that Jewish people think about the concept of death and the afterlife and judgment before the Lord and all of those things. And the first time you watch that scene, you're in Pryor's position where he's like, okay. Oh, man, I love it when you sound all smart. I don't know what you're saying, though. But it's a conversation that becomes especially important to their relationship in the second episode, because what Lewis is talking about is he's like, here's how, at least how I think of Judaism, is what the afterlife isn't really important. This whole Christian notion of, like, either you have salvation or damnation, that's not how I think about it, because that's just so binary and simplistic. Like, either you're a bad person or a good person. That's just not how the world works. And so what he's saying is Christianity and religious belief systems like that focus on the verdict, what your whole life comes down to as a kind of thumbs up or a thumbs down. But for people who are Jewish, again, this is like his conception of Judaism. I don't know too much about Judaism myself, so I'm not sure how accurate it is. But he says it's more for Jewish people about just the act of judgment, just the fact that you are going to, like, sit before the Lord, and your entire life in its totality, in all of its nuance and detail, is going to be considered and judged and reflected upon. Not for the purpose of saying, like, hey, you were good or hey, you were bad, but just for the purpose of, like, understanding everything that it meant. And so he's like, that difference between judgment and verdict is really important. And that ends up being the crux of, like, what Pryor and Lewis fundamentally disagree about in the second episode, which we'll talk more about later. But I just found that dichotomy really fascinating. And I think we should just track it going into the next episode.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's appropriate, too, that we have multiple characters in the series that are lawyers or working around the Justice Department.
Right. Yeah.
They are thinking about, even the ones who are not of the Jewish faith are thinking about judgment and who deserves salvation and whatnot in their day-to-day life all the time. Yeah. There's a wonderful scene in the second episode where Joe talks about the emptiness of the Justice Department on his day off, and that stuff is again circling around this series the entire time, and it's really fascinating.
And it that has a political dimension too when you think about politics in the Reagan era where Joe is talking to Harper at the beginning of the episode, and he's like, people know what's good again. They know what's right and wrong. Like, President Reagan says that there's truth and you can speak it. And what that ends up translating to actually is not a more complete, truthful view of the world, but a more binary, judgmental view of like who are the good people, who are the bad people, who is sort of accepted in this country and who is ignored or pushed down or harmed by that way of thinking. So
Right,
I think that has a political dimension too.
If anything, the Reagan era made it easier to lay the line between good and bad guys, and like what are the countries that we work with, and what are the countries that are the bad dudes, and all that.
And when you think about how people conceptualized AIDS, and Roy Cohn talks about it at the end of the episode, where he's like, AIDS is something that you get if you're homosexual or a drug addict. And that's just how people thought about it. Like, okay, you do these bad behaviors. These bad behaviors are what exposes you to the disease. So if only bad people are getting the disease, then it's a disease for bad people. And it's like, that's not how it fucking works. That's like a horrible, horrible way to think about people's lives and about this epidemic. And that is a directly social, political, religious, philosophical problem that the play is trying to address.
And these are beliefs that people still hold, right? That the people who get these illnesses are good and bad. I mean, we are on the way pivoting outwards from a global pandemic right now as of this recording. And I was just talking to Magellan and to my father today. We went for a walk about the idea of not anti-vaxxers, but people who have good and bad reasons to distrust the COVID-19 vaccines. And the frustrations that come from saying blanket statements like either everybody who takes it is ignorant or everybody who doesn't want to take it is stupid. Like, these are both extremely harmful views to have because they put value judgments. And this is something I feel like I bring up to friends and family a lot. It's just something that's always around my head. But we blame the people, not the system that causes this. Like, I don't blame people for getting AIDS. I blame a system for not helping them treat it. I mean, at the end of this episode, when James Cromwell, who's playing Roy Cohn's doctor, is telling him like, oh, they have a treatment that's like super experimental and costs so much money. That ended up being the treatment that they used to quote unquote cure AIDS. It was already made. They just didn't give it to everyone for a while because they were like, it's still in testing and only rich people can afford it right now. Like, they just had it. Yeah. And when I was watching the end of this episode and my mom had come into the room and I was telling her, oh, I'm watching this thing about these people who are dying from AIDS. She was like, oh, isn't that like totally treatable? And I'm like, yeah, but just 30 years ago, it was a death sentence. It didn't take that long for us to figure it out, but in the grand scheme of things, but that also led to millions of people dying because of this. Yeah. Because we couldn't just create equitability and actually help people in a systemic way. We had to blame the people, not the system.
Right. Watching How to Survive a Plague is so infuriating because it is that story where you see in 1989 a scientist guy that they're interviewing being like, so we figured out this core thing about how to treat AIDS in 1989. And then it takes until 1996 for the sort of like cocktail of drugs that ends up leading to people who have AIDS have it be undetectable in their systems. It takes until 1996 for that to be like widely available because there's not the political will to like invest in and push for that without coordinated, ceaseless activism for a decade, basically, to make that sort of stuff happen. And you see interviews with George H.W. Bush where he's like, wow, we're putting plenty of money into AIDS. I don't know what the problem is. And then in the presidential debate, George H.W. Bush is like, anyway, it's a behavioral disease. You know, tell people to change their behavior and it'll be fine. I don't see what the friggin' problem is. It's fucking maddening to watch. Yeah.
I mean, just think about you talking about the Catholic Church telling people that condoms are a sin, and then cut to the scene in episode 2 where Pryor is with, where Lewis is with the sex worker, and they have that whole joke scene. Like that scene is funny because of the societal understanding of how gay people do or do not use condoms. It is directly responding to that. And I feel like this miniseries does a good job of being like, yep, you're intelligent enough to know how this would work in real life. And we're going to do it in a different way because this is, occasionally dipping into like idealist history, and working around that.
And just on the condoms thing, and then we can get back into the show. There's a moment in How to Survive a Plague where Peter Staley, who's like one of the founder guys of ACT UP, goes on TV on this CNN program. I don't think it was Crossfire, but it was like a precursor to that kind of show.
I know the interview you're talking about. I don't think it's Crossfire.
Yeah,
no, maybe it is.
It might be. But there's one of the interviewers is basically like, so anyway, if someone, what's your advice to like maybe a younger brother or something who's worried about the interviewer's like someone who has homosexual tendencies.
Yeah.
And is worried about contracting AIDS. What would you say? And Peter Staley's like, wear a condom and use lubricant. And the guy's like, what about abstinence? And you wouldn't preach that? And Peter Staley's like, that's not going to work. You can't just tell people not to have sex. They're going to have sex. So tell them how to do it safely and like give them what they need to do it safely. And then he says to the interviewer guy, he's like, would you rather tell people to be abstinent and then they don't and thousands, millions of people die? Or would you like to let people have homosexual sex with each other and make sure that it's safe? And the guy's like, okay, anyway, thanks for coming on. And he doesn't answer it. It's fucking maddening.
People should really, if you don't want to watch all of How to Survive a Plague, just look up Peter Staley Crossfire, because that interview is absolutely incredible. It's like these two Republican shitbags and this like young, fresh-faced Peter Staley in the center being like, guys, I did the research. I'm not a dumb kid that you brought on the show. Like, I know literally more about this than you do. And they're like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah. Like, he's so confident. Oh my God, the power that that man has. It's incredible.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's such an incredible figure. And all of that again, that narrative is centered around these characters' lives as they go through their times in the miniseries. And I want to talk about our first introduction to Al Pacino's Roy Cohn, who we were really floored by the first time we saw this. I was not fully aware that Al Pacino was in Angels in America. And it did hit me once again in that first scene where he's just Pacinoing it up. We're getting like pans around his office as Joe Pitt, Patrick Wilson's Joe Pitt, comes in to talk to him about something, and he's like doing this incredible bit where he's taking multiple phone calls, putting them on hold, and then trying to pick up other phone calls and talk to Joe at the same time. And Joe is just us being like, can you just talk to me? It's Pacino at his finest, like scenery chewing chaos, I guess.
Yeah. I think what I really appreciated, Pacino does an incredible job in this whole miniseries. In the second episode especially, we'll talk about just like he does some really incredible work there. But in that scene, reflecting on it and him sort of, switching between the calls, what I was floored by on the second watch, like obviously it's a very funny scene and it's meant to be, but also it explains to you how effortlessly Roy Cohn has compartmentalized all of these aspects of himself. It's like completely second nature to him to know who he's talking to and how he's going to talk about himself and what he's going to present to them. Like he's one moment talking to some people who are coming from out of town and want to see a show on Broadway, and he's like, oh, we'll go see Cats or something. And they're like, what about this one play? And he's like, oh no, you won't like that one. And I looked it up, and it's this musical that was this like watershed musical, one of the first Broadway musicals to openly depict a homosexual relationship, I think. And on the phone, he's like, oh, you're not going to like that one. And then he holds the phone to his chest and he asks Joe if Joe's seen it. And Joe's like, no, I haven't. And Roy Cohn loves it. He's gushing about it. And it tells you everything you need to know about this guy, that he like has totally accepted about himself that he is attracted to men, whether he's homosexual or bisexual or whatever. He doesn't really like choose a label for himself. But he has totally like integrated that into his life and lives that and confidently lives it, but keeps it very contained. And yeah, I don't know, but you just learn that about him, and that ends up being like something that Joe stares in the face of, and it's sort of like, oh, I could become this kind of guy.
Exactly.
Or not.
Yeah, I didn't even pick up on this in watching it, but there is they are intending for us to see Joe as well as like he watches Roy Cohn and thinks, oh, I can also compartmentalize like parts of my identity that I don't want to share with the rest, and I can be successful at the same time and have people who care about me. And as Roy says later when he talks to his doctor, like be the kind of person that people know and ask for.
Yeah.
Because Joe, we learn a couple minutes later, is a closeted gay man, as Lewis very astutely picks up on when they meet in the bathroom. And he's trying to hide that desperately from himself as well, because, again, born in Utah, Mormon, moved to New York City for work, and is like trying to escape this. That's why he wants to move to DC, because he's like, well, things are happening in DC, and I can like bury myself in my work and my life and these like successful people like Roy Cohn, and I won't have to think about like the, New York City was in a big way a epicenter for like the gay movement. So like maybe I can get away from that also and go back to just working and not thinking about it. I found a lot to appreciate about Joe Pitt. Patrick Wilson, I've never really appreciated this guy. I've like seen him in things, but there's something about his performance and just the agony, the pain that he feels from acknowledging the truth in his heart, but also wanting to say it. I mean, there's that like that gut punch of a scene later where him and Harper are talking. I know I'm jumping around, but it's in this episode where, she's trying to get him. He's trying to get her to ask the question, and she's like, "Do you want me to really just ask you? This is going to ruin our night." And he's like, "You just ask me." Yeah. And she says, "Are you a homosexual?" And it's like, in a way, he wants the words to be said out loud, right? On one hand, he doesn't want to admit it, and he wants to be able to say no, and it's your fault that you're telling me that because he's in his words, you're crazy and you're on drugs.
Yeah, you're trying to destroy me is what he says to her.
Right. But then literally in the second episode, he's like, all I want is to be destroyed. He's clearly imposing his will on her, which is what, again, he says later, is what he likes about her, is what made him, quote unquote, fall in love with Harper. Is that I think he says, like, I liked that she's wrong about things and that I can be right about things with her. It's a really complex and sad relationship, honestly.
I think there's more to his attraction to her than that also. Like, just to sort of bring that, I think it's fine to talk about that now, even though it happens in the second episode. But when he's talking to Roy Cohn about his wife, he's talking about how, like, he's kind of having this revelation that what he loved about Harper was that she wasn't a very good Mormon. Like she was always getting into trouble or just like disagreeing with how things are supposed to be done. And I think what Joe saw in her is someone who was as conflicted as he was about like this sort of idea of how you're supposed to be or the things you're supposed to conform to. And I think it's not so much that he's like, she's wrong and I'm right, but more so like she's someone who is like doing what's expected of her, but also fucking up at it or purposefully doing it wrong or subverting it. And maybe in some way there's like a pathway towards me being able to escape from this through having a relationship with her. And I think he really wants for her to like do the work of pulling him out of what he's trapped himself in. But he also is like mean to her when she does that and yells at her and calls her names and tells her she's ugly and whatever. But I think that ultimately like he's with her because he knows that she sees him for who he is and sees the world for what it is. And he like craves that to a certain extent.
Oh, man. It's, I think I literally brought this up on Pilot Chats, but I haven't seen Marriage Story. But there's just something so hard about watching a marriage fall apart. Yeah. Like, watching a two boyfriends relationship fall apart because one of them is dying is a very distinct kind of sad, right? Because it's not that they stopped loving each other, it's just that they're finding this truth to be so difficult to handle that one of them needs to get out, even though he's put in a lot of effort into this relationship. Yeah. Whereas with this, it's like they had it, and we're not catching them in like any sort of height of their relationship. We're catching them right before the collapse. And I find that such a fascinating like point of a relationship to focus on, because a lot of stories don't choose that point. They say like, oh, they got past it or they grew past it. And this is like, no, they're tired of, they've probably done that 100 times. They've probably had the moment where they had this whole fight before and they cried about it and then they had like passionless sex and then they moved on. But we're done doing that. And it's so hard to watch. I was already feeling some kind of way last night when I was watching these episodes, and 3 times I cried watching these episodes, 3 separate times, mostly in the second one, because the second one kind of heightens all the tragedy, but it was almost entirely Joe and Harper stuff. I'm struggling to put words to it, but I think it's a combination of their performances and the way that I've like seen variants of this relationship before that really hit me.
Yeah, I think what's really painful about it is that both of them care about each other so much and want for the other person to be happy, but also want for the other person to make them happy. And those two things are just mutually exclusive in their relationship. And so that ends up causing this friction and anger and hurt. And it's this horrible thing of like, I'm in so much pain because of you, but also you're the person that I want to fix it, and seeing them have to go through that and reckon with that and ultimately come to the realization that like, we can't make this work. Like the way to make this work is to be apart from each other and to find what we need somewhere else, even though like, we understand each other and really care about each other. But yeah, it's it's not my favorite kind of story to like seek out and watch for fun, because it's painful, emotionally painful.
I had to like talk to some friends and play some video games late last night because I was like, I don't want to go to bed on this. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so what the crux of this episode is the introduction of this sort of magical realism that creeps its way in and shows its face a little bit more in the second one, but the titular angels in America are showing up here and there. I still have this idea that probably Meryl Streep's character is some version of an angel if she's going to show up multiple times, depending on how you define angel. But also Harper hallucinates at one point. Presumably it's a hallucination. Again, with magic realism, it's not really obvious. A gentleman played by Jeffrey Wright. What is his character's name again? Mr. something?
Mr. Lies, I think.
Yeah, Mr. Lies, who in this scene at least shows himself as a travel agent who's like, oh, where do you want to go? And she's like, I want to get out of here once and for all. And, where exactly can I take you? And she's like, oh, Antarctica. I want to see the hole in the ozone layer, which is such a fascinating thing to say. Like, sometimes people will ask me like, oh, when the pandemic's over, where do you want to go? And I'd like have my answers, but I would never think to say Antarctica. And he's like, I'll set you up an expedition immediately. Like he's just doing this wish fulfillment thing for her. And it's not in a like monkey's paw way. It just is like a untenable way. He's like, all right, come with me and we'll do it. Like that's not how, your dreams happen, but he's providing something for her. And I really liked that angel stuff, but the best example of sort of magical realism in these episodes is this first episode in the third act has a dream sequence where Harper actually meets Prior Walter in their collective dream. It's in this beautiful it's sort of like a church, but sort of like the backstage of an opera or something. I think this scene is incredible. I want a scene like this in every single episode. I love dream sequences. I know these work better in plays because you can just kind of like play around with the sets and stuff, but they do it really well here. It's not like Twin Peaksy dream sequence. It's not like clocks melting. It's just people being their truest selves. Prior engaging in some wonderful drag, putting on some wonderful drag makeup, and Harper looking beautiful with this like incredible flowing dress. I think this is a kind of weird thing to say, but like a lot of directors and writers that I've seen work with Mary Louise Parker don't seem to understand the way that she's attractive. Like she's definitely traditionally attractive, but like in a sort of mature adult way. And I think this was like the first scene I've ever seen with her where I was like, yes, they get it. They totally get it. It's not like ogling her body, but it's just like she gets to be comfortable finally and like look like a person. And they meet and talk, and they're weirdly comfortable with each other because they're like, "You're in my hallucination. You're in my dream. What the hell is going on?" And I thought it was so sad here that Prior Walter is like, my drag makeup doesn't even look good in my dream. Like, what? and then starts rubbing it off later because he's like, I'm diseased and I'm sick. Like, this is not their idealist dream. It's their like, it's what a dream actually is, which is it's your like subconscious thoughts coming to the surface.
Yeah, and the scene is set with, we've watched Sunset Boulevard for the show at this point. The scene is set with Pryor looking in the mirror and saying, "I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille," and
the camera exactly echoing that scene as well.
Right, and I think that speaks to this sort of tone of like self-denial and faded beauty and like things being dressed up to look a certain way and be kind of what's the word, austere, but really they just are kind of vacant and ghostly, and and that I think echoes sort of how Harper and Pryor are feeling about their relationships and how they're feeling about themselves, and it's a really beautiful scene and haunting in its way. And then I was curious what you thought about Harper and Pryor give each other these like revelations, and Pryor tells Harper like, "Okay, your husband is gay," and Harper tells Pryor, "There's a thing inside of you that's completely free of disease." And I'm curious what you thought about that being his revelation and like what that means.
Yeah, I thought the revelation to Harper was a little unsatisfying because it's kind of like a plot convenience to be like, the thing it's just her subconscious telling her the thing you were worried about is true. Now deal with it. Don't hide from it. Which lets us have the burnt dinner scene, which is incredible. But no, her telling him that like there is something in you that is not tainted is interesting because he is still dying. Like, what is a sort of hopeful ending for Prior Walter in this story? Is it that he leaves Lewis and finds love again? Because he has love. As we see in the second episode, there are other people in his community that love and care for him. His life is not entirely attached to Lewis, but they still care about each other and they can get through it. So maybe is his salvation, is this like part of him that's free from infection being with Lewis happily until he dies? Because I personally, and I don't know how this ends, I don't think Prior Walter makes it. I think that this ends up being a story where he dies. And Lewis has to deal with it. I don't know. I don't know what the world without disease for him actually looks like.
Yeah, I sort of thought about it as like that's his soul or something, or whatever the sort of equivalent of the soul is in this particular story. That there's just this feeling, Pryor speaks to it, where he says he feels dirty. He feels like his body, like his heart is pumping pollution through his body. And that comes back to the sort of like socio-political conception of what AIDS is as like this thing to be ashamed of, this mark of the kind of person that you are, and the complex, that comes from that. And I think finding a way to sort of be free of that thinking and see like the beauty and goodness in himself is what's going to end up happening for Pryor. Like being able to separate the sort of illness from the like morality that people put upon it. I think maybe that's where it's going to go.
And Pryor is somebody who's really savvy and very shrewd, at least when it comes to how he's going to be treated. I mean, just to briefly touch on the second episode before we get ready to transition to it, once he says before going to the hospital, "I don't want to go there. Once I go there, you're not going to see me again." And like, lo and behold, once they go there, they break up. So like, or they're like, they're talking about it seriously.
Yeah.
So he totally knew that this was all going to happen, and he's just watching it, and it just feels like his life is in an incredibly dark and difficult to climb out of place. So yeah, maybe this ends up being about like what does salvation look like for you? So it's something it's kind of like something I'm curious to follow, but I don't think we've gotten a good answer for just yet.
Yeah.
And this episode gets to again, one of the best scenes of either of these so far, where Joe comes home from his work, and then Harper tells him she burned dinner because she turned the oven all the way up, and he's like, I'm so sorry. And she's like, no, my dinner was fine. I burned your dinner because I'm mad, but I'm not crazy because I'm not on pills right now because you told me they're bad. And she's just talking so fast and like looping around her own points. And he's like, what is this conversation? Like, what do you want me to say to you right now? Because he keeps doing this thing where he would rather talk about her than think about himself and self-reflect.
Right.
And all she wants is for him to self-reflect and say what is in his head.
Yeah.
The only way to get that truth out of him is to, as she says later, now we both have secrets, because he asks her if she's pregnant, and she says, yeah, for sure. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. You don't get to know. I'm not telling you. Fuck you. It's incredible. It's incredible.
Yeah.
I wish I had more. I wish I had more to say about this stuff. Do you actually think, by the way, that Harper's pregnant?
No. I don't think so.
She just wants that sort of advantage over him.
Yeah, I think she's just trying to make him understand what it feels like to be her and to be constantly questioning this very intimate thing about the person that you're with.
Yeah. Also, something I didn't notice in the first time watching this episode was in that last scene with Pryor and Lewis talking in their apartment. There are like monks doing Hare Krishna chants that walk by. Again, I think it's just like religion is all around us and salvation is all around us, and we're just like people surrounded by it. But I thought that was an interesting touch that I didn't even pick up on the first time. And then, this one just wraps on this incredible scene that we keep talking about, where Roy Cohn's doctor, played by James Cromwell, the excellent actor himself, is trying to tell Roy, like, you have AIDS and you got it from having homosexual sex with men. And basically Roy is like, I'm not a homosexual. Homosexuals don't have connections like I do. It's stunning. It's another just like, hey, Al Pacino, go off. Go do your thing. I've never heard somebody say the phrase, I have liver cancer, and it was the most intense, scary delivery ever.
I have liver cancer.
You're like, shit, I guess you do? Like, you start to believe it?
Yeah. It's an incredibly powerful scene, and again speaks to just the problem. Besides, the documentary How to Survive a Plague gets into, to a certain extent, this division that happens among members of ACT UP, with regard to what exactly they're fighting for, and some members of the group making it about like fighting for changing the structure of like how to test drugs and how the FDA and the NIH approves and distributes things, like thinking about this as a medical issue, and some members of the organization thinking about it as like a hearts and minds kind of social issue and a political issue. And this scene really speaks to just what was the core social problem of the AIDS epidemic, which is you have someone like Roy Cohn saying like, yeah, I have sex with men, but the word homosexual in our society doesn't say what your sexuality is. It says what your status is. And so that's why I'm going to refuse the label and I'm going to deny the fact that I have AIDS, because it's not this sort of neutral medical determination. It is a determination about how I'm going to be treated by other people. And that is what got in the way for so long of this disease being addressed in the way that it needed to be.
The tragedy of it all.
Yeah.
Like Cromwell ends this episode saying, no, AIDS is not something you fuck around with, period. That's the end of it. You don't get, I don't care how you got it. He said, because Roy is like, if you say that I'm homosexual, I'm going to end your career and like, end your whole world. And he's like, fine, you have AIDS. You got it from having gay sex. How that happened, why that happened, up to you. Go with God, basically.
Right.
So I'm actually curious, like, I know that Roy is going to spend a lot of this, or part of this series at least, in the hospital. Because he's not long for this world.
Yeah.
We know that the real life Roy Cohn died in the 80s. So, by episode 2, he's already like, Joe, I'm sick and I'm dying from liver cancer. But I think we can call it here for part 1. Yeah. Again, a fantastic opening. And after this break, we will be back to talk about Millennium Approaches Chapter 2, In Vitro.
Welcome back to Angels in Chatz America. The second episode that we watched this week was Millennium Approaches Chapter 2, In Vitro. Like all of the episodes of Angels in America, it was directed by Mike Nichols and written by Tony Kushner. This one aired on December 7th, 2003. Alan, what happens in Chapter 2 of Millennium Approaches?
Is in vitro the thing where you put the baby in someone?
Uh-huh.
What's that have to do with anything in this story?
I don't know.
We'll talk about it. In this episode, Lewis abandons a hospitalized Pryor. Joe and Roy confide in each other over drinks, and Joe makes a drunken confession to his mother. So, hey guys, you may have thought that first episode was really dark. Well, this one's kind of... Well, okay, dark is an interesting word, because Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines dark...
I would say it's heavy more than it is dark.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. This is not a violent miniseries, and it's not a, like, I don't think it's even to use a crass term, I don't think it's even tragedy porn.
No.
I think it's just, it's realistic. Going back to what I was saying in part one about how they talk like real people in this, mostly.
Yeah.
It's just like real troubles that people were facing and talking through. These are conversations that happen in private that you're getting to see on a stage.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately a show that's like sorrowful or mournful, and it's about sort of like aching more than it is about like, and here are the statistics of how many people died of AIDS or something like that.
Yeah. This opens though with what I would call a grim scene, where Pryor Walter is on the ground in him and Lewis's apartment, just absolutely in agony, in incredible pain, bleeding, and Lewis picks him up and like starts freaking out. And amazing performance. You know he's saying like, God help me in this moment. Coming back to the religion conversation.
Yeah.
Lewis has not abandoned his faith yet. Not to say that he will, but he's saying, Pryor, I need to call an ambulance, which is intense and a lot because Pryor's begging him not to. He's saying if you call it, then you're never going to see me again, but I have to because he's like, just let me lie here. Do you think here is the moment where Pryor is like asking for death, or what is his sort of motivation in the scene for not wanting to be taken to the hospital, other than knowing that the relationship is going to get worse?
When I first watched this scene, the way that I interpreted it was like him being afraid of going to the hospital because the hospital is like the place where people are sick and where people die. You know what I mean? And so
totally.
Maybe he's sort of thinking that way. Like, if I can just get through it and tough it out here at home, then it'll be fine. But when I go into the hospital, that's the beginning of the end. But
I become a sick person.
Yeah, right. And I think that's part of it. But I think the other part of it, and maybe more so what's going on, is what you're saying, where he knows, like, this is going to be the end of our relationship. Like, I know you. I know how you're going to act. You're going to send me to that hospital and you're going to leave me. Because in the first episode, when they're in bed together, there are two really important things that are said. The first is Pryor's telling Lewis the symptoms that he's been having. And he's trying to downplay it and say like, oh, whatever, my ass is chapped from diarrhea. I was vomiting blood or shitting blood or whatever it was. And then he's like, but I'll tell you if it gets really bad. And Lewis is like, shitting blood sounds pretty bad to me. And what's happening there is Pryor, and he says this somewhere else too, in the first or the second episode, Pryor knows that like, if he truly tells Lewis what's going on, he's going to have to like comfort Lewis. And he just doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want that to be how this works. And he doesn't want to push Lewis away by being honest with him about what's going on and what he needs. So yeah, I think what's going on in this moment is he knows like, if I go to the hospital, that's it. Because the other thing that happens when they're in bed together is Lewis says, hey, you love me, right? Pryor says, yeah. And Lewis says, if I left you, would you hate me forever? And Pryor gives him a kiss and leans in really, really close and says, yes. Yes, I would hate you forever if you did that.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah. So they both know what's going on here, but it's so fucking sad. And what a horrible, honest depiction of like how we think about illness and how hard it is to be with someone through illness. That illness is this like personal failure, or this like corruption, or this thing to hide and be ashamed of. And it's just, yeah, it was really, really devastating to then see they go to the hospital and see Lewis leave him there. It sucks.
The nurse, yeah. Oh God, and I know seeing somebody on the floor, like who could seek help but is choosing not to for various reasons, is just like fundamentally so sad, and taps into something that a lot of people have experienced, which is like, you know, a lot of communities also distrust medical practices. Getting back to what I was talking about with the people being afraid of vaccines earlier. Gay folk were not always treated well in the hospital. You know, a lot of times, like you were saying, with the way that the president is talking about AIDS, it's like, oh, this guy has AIDS. Well, we're just kind of house him in a bed until he keels over. Like, which is awful. And that's something I think Pryor is also worried about.
And I was like reading about this earlier, and, you know, there's been this narrative during COVID about like our healthcare workers and frontline workers and what they're sacrificing and doing for people. And I think it's really wonderful that that has been such a universal truth about how people working in healthcare have addressed COVID. That was not the case during the AIDS epidemic. Like, doctors were divided about, and the public was divided about what exactly the duty of doctors was to treat their patients. And there was like misconceptions or misunderstandings about how this disease was spread, and doctors feeling like they needed to separate themselves from patients with AIDS in order to not spread it to other patients, and hospitals sometimes turning away people with AIDS. And then there was something in the documentary that I watched where they were talking about how there were incentives for hospitals to not correctly diagnose someone who had AIDS and things like that. So like the hospital is not necessarily like the welcoming, friendly place that you would want for it to be during this time. Whereas I think now more so during the age of COVID, that's changed. And partially because, or maybe mainly because COVID is like a disease that affects everybody, and affected a broader swath of people. But yeah, it's something that this miniseries doesn't really go into because Pryor just like gets a room to himself, and it's like a pretty nice room, and it's all fine. But yeah,
totally. The one shot of all of this hospital stuff that felt like they did understand it was when a nurse comes in later and she's like holding a mask over her face.
Yeah.
Because she's like certain that this disgusting man this sick man is going to cough on her or something and give her AIDS.
Right.
Still to this day, I know people who think like that. And also the way that we think about COVID patients is like that. But I do want to push back just a tiny bit on the idea that these worries are gone now, because definitely, even pre-pandemic, young trans youth are a lot of them are terrified of going to the hospital because you're going to be diagnosed based on your birth gender or on your sex, and that feels uncomfortable and extremely can make people feel terrible and feel out of their body in a way. And I think that honestly, not only Pryor, but even like when his friend comes to visit, they have this understanding of like, this place isn't going to take care of us, is it? This place is going to let us wait it out. I did think it was interesting though that we got this nurse who Lewis speaks to, I think. Was it Lewis who spoke to her, or was it Pryor, the Emma Thompson character?
Lewis speaks to her first. And maybe Pryor doesn't ever speak to her, actually. I don't remember. But Lewis definitely does. Yeah,
when she's talking about how like your friend is here and we're all going through a lot, that kind of thing. I think that she's a good example of a nurse who understands but can privately talk about this and be like, yeah, I totally get it, guys. Like, I'm going to try and treat you the best as I can, but the rest of this medical practice might not. I am to understand that she is another angel. I'm starting to think that a lot of the side characters that talk to them are angels, and maybe the way that this story is making us think about like angels are the people who are kind to us when no one else is. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think there's something there. Yeah.
That's my sort of my current running theory, because she's so like uncharacteristically nice, in a realistic way.
Also, it's Emma Thompson, so it's like, okay, what's significant?
What are you
going to
do with Emma Thompson?
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, I really loved I loved the scene with her talking to Lewis, and then probably one of the saddest scenes of the episode is when they have their sort of breakup. I don't know. Do you have some notes about that scene? Because it kind of most of my notes there are just like I wanted to cry.
With Pryor and Lewis's breakup later. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, actually, there is a scene before that where Lewis goes to the woods a little while outside of the bar where Roy and Joe are, and has sex with an older sex worker who is kind of doing the dominatrix thing, the dominating thing, and asking him like, can we go back to your place? And he's like, it's just so funny. It's so funny. And this episode needed this comedic scene, right? Because it's already so full of like people's relationships falling apart. And for Lewis, this is like, let me just return to something that feels normal to me, which is like, I just need to feel something, and sometimes sex is that for people. And it's him being self-destructive though, because he's saying, the guys, this is very explicit, obviously, folks. Just be aware. They're engaging in sex, and he says, "Oh, the condom broke," and he's like, "Don't worry about it. I want you to infect me. I don't care, or I don't care if you infect me." And that is the moment where the sex worker shows the humanity and goes, "I'm gonna go." Because this is a lot, and I'm not trying to get you sick. And earlier he talks about like, "Oh, we can't go back to my place because I live with my parents," which is amazing. And then Lewis is like, "Oh, say hi to your mother and father for me." And the work sex worker like slaps Lewis across the face as hard as he can and walks out. This is an incredible scene. Yeah. It's important to show this stuff, especially in remembering that like Joe has watched stuff like this happen from afar, in his sort of like fascination and like his secret examination of it. Yeah. But yeah, they eventually go back to the hospital, and we have this really intense breakup scene where Pryor is doing the judge thing and saying that you're breaking up with me at a time when you weren't supposed to, and I hate you for this, and it's unforgivable.
Yeah, and I think that this so this scene recalls that conversation that they had about like judgment versus the verdict, and I think what I found really fascinating about Lewis in this particular episode is how good of a job the show does at making you empathize with his position in all of this, because I think it's easy to sort of take on the perspective that Emma Thompson's nurse character does when he first leaves and she looks down the hall basically to say like, what the fuck are you doing? Where are you going? Why are you doing this? And I think, we would all like to tell ourselves that if we were in Lewis's position, we would stay with the person that we love until the bitter end. But like, that's an incredibly hard, harrowing thing to do. And this is the hardest thing that Pryor has ever had to do, but it's also the hardest thing that Lewis has ever had to do as well, to watch his partner die in front of him to a disease that he also could die to eventually and contract or whatever. So I think this scene does a really powerful job of not necessarily saying like one person is in the right or in the wrong, but showing just what is so truly heart-wrenching and difficult about this for both of them. And I was really moved by Lewis saying like, trying to make this ultimately kind of in its way pathetic case of like, hey, you can love someone and fail them. And he's like, just, recognize the nuance of that and give me a little credit for the years and years of like good times and love and support that we had. Like, I can still say that I loved you, but I just can't do this. And Pryor's basically saying like, no, it doesn't work like that. You don't get to take this sort of like zoomed out perspective. You are abandoning me in the moment where it counts. And so therefore, fuck you, you don't love me. And that's how it goes. And I just found that scene really fascinating and kind of the core of what their relationship is all about, is this debate about like, okay, well, what matters? Is it the sort of totality of the relationship in their lives together, or is it about this one crucial moment and what Lewis chose to do or not do in that moment?
And it's once again judgment versus verdict, right?
Uh-huh.
It's like, is the life you lived what you're working towards, or is it the end goal? And I just, people need to watch this episode, especially because it's some of the best performances. I think both Ben Shankman, who plays Lewis, and Justin Kirk, who plays Prior Walter, are like, this is like Emmy work, you know?
Yeah.
Or whatever
you
get.
Do you agree with what I am saying, that the show kind of doesn't like take a side, or do you feel a particular way about either of those characters?
I don't think the show has taken a side yet. And I guess in terms of me, it depends on your religion or whatever you believe in the afterlife. Do you think that it is a like, and it's weird. I hate that I always say this, but I most people when I talk about this stuff are like, you should watch The Good Place. But like The Good Place totally talks about like, hey, the sitcom is like, hey, is your whether or not you get into heaven, depending on your faith, is it the total of like your good and bads, or is it something bigger than that? Is it something more complicated than that?
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to lean towards it being more complicated because no individual action can be objectively rated as, you know, +1, -1.
Yeah.
I don't think it would ever work like it wouldn't make sense for it to work like that.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, the stuff that like makes me think about what is the totality of my life worth, I see reflected less in Lewis and Pryor's plot and more in Joe and Harper's plot, because of how much it is about what you show people versus how much of your life is like public to others.
And the show wants you to draw a connection between the two because they intercut those like dramatic breakup scenes with each other when you're watching it. Yeah.
Yeah, Harper and Joe's is like filmed fairly traditionally but very hectically, and then Pryor and Lewis's is straight up them both looking into camera. We are them. We are both of them looking back at each other. Which I thought was a great touch. But yeah, I don't think the show has made that decision yet of like what is the or if it will. I don't know. That's the weird thing about covering a miniseries is there are certain questions when you're watching it like episode to episode that you're like, yeah, not yet. This isn't this theme hasn't been because when you watch a show where each episode is a complete picture, it's like, okay, this one says this about it, but I don't feel like I can say that. I can answer that question just yet.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if that's like a cop-out answer.
No, I think that's fair. I think that's how I think about it too. I just know that there are probably people who would watch this scene and could say, like, Lewis is a terrible person or whatever.
Yeah.
I think I could understand why someone would say that. Or I could understand why someone might say, like, Pryor is being cruel or unfair or something like that.
Or yeah, going the other way. Like Joe is I watched the first episode and finished the first episode saying Joe sucks. And now I suddenly feel a kinship with Joe that I have never felt with a TV character in a while.
Right. And I think ultimately what this miniseries does really well and what the play does really well is it says like each one of these characters is having a complex human experience that is worthy of our empathy. And it's just a question of like whether you can muster it within yourself to empathize with these people despite like the things that they do that are objectively wrong in the process of struggling with what they're struggling with.
Yeah, I was thinking about when watching this breakup scene, like if I could show this series to, you know, my parents, for example, because I think it would obviously, unfortunately, it would be difficult for both my folks to reconcile like this is a gay relationship that you are and you're supposed to like these characters because they still have like conservative thoughts about like homosexual men especially but I think that they would still like it because I think emotion crosses that barrier. You know what I mean? I think you can eventually cross it. It's hard for some people, unfortunately. And I'm not saying this like a damning way to my folks, but it would take a bit. But they would eventually get it. They would eventually like this a lot.
Yeah, because ultimately this is something that transcends the particulars of the relationship or the scene. This idea of like, you know, it's the whole like wedding vows thing of in sickness and in health, and what does that really mean and look like, and to what extent can you be with someone through something that is like harmful to yourself as well, versus when do you need to do what Lewis is saying, where he's like, I need to save myself. Yeah, I think that's a thing that people deal with in their lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What did you think about this other scene, the return of Jeffrey Wright, when he visits Pryor in the hospital, the two of them, and he's wearing very effeminate clothing, and he's looking beautiful, and they just have a moment of like kindness and intimacy that we so far haven't gotten to see from the main couples on the show.
Yeah.
Because he brings this ointment that he says is like from this like magical woman, like soothsayer, whatever you want to say, and medicine woman, and he rubs it on Pryor's stomach like this will help you with the lesions or whatever, and it's not played like it's played really well. I mean, for 2003 2004 or whatever, this is like a positive and in from my experience, like really accurate portrayal of like the way that young queer folks can like find extended family in each other and love and kindness without it being romantic or sexual. It's just like these guys are actually probably had they mention like we've had intercourse with each other, we've done it, but we're not dating, but it's just like you can do that with your friends and it's okay. I really like this. I will never stop feeling weird about the fact that I don't know about Jeffrey Wright, but I know for a fact that Justin Kirk is identifies as a straight man, and it's just like guys. They and usually I can compartmentalize this because it's it's an adaptation and blah blah blah, but Jeffrey Wright's character is like the only person of color that we've seen in a while, and he even acknowledges like that fact at one point in this conversation. I forget what the line is exactly, but they're talking about like other young black gay men, and then he just walks out, and it's like. Is his purpose in this scene and as the angel to like provide literally salve and like warmth and kindness to these main characters and then to just leave? Like does that give him agency, or like how do you feel about that? I know this is a complicated ass topic, obviously. Yeah,
I mean it's a really important scene to examine in the context of the criticism that we brought up in the pilot and that you brought up in the first half around just like what characters is this story about ultimately? Because we were having this conversation about how, just like the rabbi says at the beginning, these characters aren't people, they're whole kinds of people. And yet it seems like this story is saying like, the whole kinds of people that are affected by this thing are all middle-class white people, ostensibly. And that's obviously not the case. And so I really appreciated the scene for showing Pryor's connection to a community that looks different than that, and looks different than the world that Joe and Lewis are a part of, this sort of like legal suit-wearing city hall type of world. And I wanted to see more of that world and see more of this character that Pryor talks to. And I felt the same way, that it's like, wow, this is such a wholesome, heartwarming scene of like support. And thinking about Jeffrey Wright's character being, he says that he's a nurse, and also talks about like other friends of his who he's seen die or who he's supported through this. And to see that represented was, I think, really important and moving. But when I watched the scene, I didn't fully make the connection that it's the same actor also playing Mr. Lies. And when you said that, I was like, oh, for fuck's sake, guys, come on. Because then
he's doing the exact same thing.
Because then it turns it into, because I wanted to follow Jeffrey Wright's character out the door and see what his life is like. And see that part of this. And instead, what I'm now being made to believe is that he's this kind of like semi-person, but more so just a representation, which that's what the main characters are, but it's different. I don't know. Like you're saying, it seems like he exists to serve Pryor's story as opposed to existing on his own terms. So I was bothered by that, but I do think that there's still quite a lot in this scene to really cherish and recognize as well done, despite that.
There are countless examples of this, right? Like, these are people who live real lives. I literally know people who gay men who call each other cis and use like just drop she her pronouns because that's how they talk to each other, and the way that he speaks to Pryor is so believable. But this is such a common thing in media of like, we have our main characters and our heroes and our villains, and then we have the like kind gay and or queer or trans characters who support them and are nice to them. And that is often lauded as good representation, but at the end of the day, it's like they almost never get the story to be about them. And if they do, it's often muddled in tragedy.
Yeah.
So, I think that you could also make the argument if they decided like, oh, we're going to recast Angels in America to be an all like queer black cast or whatever, that it would just be like, all right, well, there's black suffering on the screen. Like, it's kind of the issue of representation here is definitely a doomed if you do, doomed if you don't issue, but I still want to see it, and I still want to like stories that explore that more, because that's real life, and that's really what was happening in the 80s, and kind of putting those characters in the background suggests that it wasn't happening, and I think that's where the issue comes from.
And I think what I also am bothered by is the contrast between, you have the dream sequence in the first episode where Pryor is wearing drag, and it's meant to be this very beautiful depiction of him in drag, which I thought was great. And it's complex because of all the other sort of like ghostly imagery that we were talking about. And then you have Jeffrey Wright's character walking in with the feather boa and his whole outfit, and someone walks by him in the hallway and gives him a look like, wow, you're dressed pretty weird.
You're weird.
And that's also kind of how the camera looks at him, it feels like.
Yeah, a little bit.
And the camera doesn't look at him with the same sort of like affection or intimacy or sense of beauty as the camera looks at Pryor in the drag makeup and costume. And so it's sort of like, what are you doing here? Because you're kind of like, I don't know, you're kind of glamorizing like Pryor dipping into this sort of stuff. But then this is Jeffrey Wright's character who just dresses this way every day. It's just how he exists and dresses. And you're looking at it and telling me that it's like a little bit out of the normal or weird, or look how different he is from all the other suit-wearing middle-class white people of the story. And that rubbed me the wrong way as well.
Yeah, it's an issue. It's an issue worth discussing when bringing up this series, and like in multiple adaptations of the play, they've had the same problem. I think Jeffrey Wright actually plays this character in many has played on Broadway as well. So it's complicated, and I wish that they could do it better, but it's something to acknowledge in discussing the series. So I want to also talk about our the characters that make me cry the most. It's Joe and Harper. Speaking of like opening on really affecting scenes. They're talking. I don't remember exactly what the context was of their first argument, but Harper is asking him about his faith and about like his Mormonism and like, what do you pray for? Do you pray to God, and what do you pray for? And just the naked honesty when he says that I pray for God to crush me into tiny pieces and build me back from nothing. Is a sentiment that I've absolutely. I mean, to be honest, it's something I've sort of felt before. As a, bisexual Christian person, I definitely feel a conflict between the private life that I keep and the world around me and like my family and my faith. There is a dissonance there. And like so many characters in Angels in America, the way that I get through it is by compartmentalizing.
Right.
That identity is for people that I trust and people I'm out to. Like you, the listener of the podcast. And I feel comfortable saying that, but I'm also like, I don't talk about that with some people, and it doesn't exist to some people, and that can honestly tear you apart sometimes. And I understand, like, so when I first came out, I was like, why would anybody ever come out to their parents? I don't understand. Like, why would you ever even bother taking that risk? And the answer is that sometimes they do support you.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to say like mine absolutely wouldn't, but it's still a question.
Yeah.
It's still something I get at that keeps me up at night a little bit. And so I totally feel Joe being like, I wish that I just was not broken.
Yeah.
Like, I wish that I could just hit the reset button and either be in a different life or not be the way I am. Yeah. Instead of like the world should change, you feel internally that you should change.
Yeah. And it's so heartbreaking. I appreciate you being open about that stuff, by the way.
Of course.
And Joe talks about it in this episode and the previous episode in such violent terms. Like when he's talking to Harper and he's yelling at her and he's like, I've tried so hard to like kill what's inside of me and make my outward behavior look exactly the way it's supposed to look. And he's like, that's all I can do. I'm an empty shell because of like the things that I've had to do to sort of get by and look the way that I'm supposed to look. And it was really affecting when he tells Harper, I pray for God to crush me or whatever. And she's like, oh, I don't want you to pray for that. Like he feels that he's doing it for her, and to give her something. And her response is like, you're not giving me anything by doing that. You're not like, I love you and I want for you to be sexually attracted to me and be straight or whatever, because that's what I want. But like you pretending to do that makes you miserable and makes you deny a part of yourself and kill a part of yourself. And it's a suffering that's like affecting both of us. So I found that revelation from Joe really, really powerful as well.
Roy basically asks him later, he's like, why don't you do the thing that makes you happy? He like just puts it in. Sometimes it takes having an outside force to ask you like, someone asked me like, why don't you just come out to your parents? And it's like, because I'm worried. Okay, well then don't do it. Okay, but it sucks for me to not do it. Okay, well then do it. And like, why don't you, he's saying like, why don't you go to DC? And, in that first conversation between Joe and Harper, she's saying like, I think you should go and leave me. And he says, I can't leave without you. Like, I care about you too much. She's like, cool. Okay, I'm going to leave you.
Yeah.
Like, you have to face an ultimatum at some point as an adult and make this decision. So I'm really, really invested in them and seeing where that ends up going. She actually says an amazing line in that scene about her own like anxiety about her addiction.
Yeah.
She says, maybe I'll give birth to a pill. That'll give a new meaning to pill popping. And Mary Elizabeth Parker like laughs in a way that feels like she laughed at the line, but in a believable, like nice way. I loved it. I thought it was so good.
Yeah.
And she like leaves him on the floor in the dark, being like, "All right, bud, you have to make this decision at some point. Good luck."
Yeah.
And we pivot to this other great scene where he's at the bar with Roy Cohn, very intimate, very flirty on Roy's part. Clearly, this is the scene that I said I had a piece of trivia about.
Okay.
We haven't been able to do like Chatz trivia in a while, but I did find one here. The song that the Bart, the piano player, is playing, it's the Angels in America theme.
Oh, okay.
It's like a cute piano version. Do you want another piece of trivia from this episode?
Sure.
This one's going to actually blow your brain open. Get ready. I think, according to IMDb, the guy, the leather sex worker that Lewis has sex with, I think that's Justin Kirk.
Who's Justin Kirk?
Pryor Walter.
Oh.
Isn't that weird?
Interesting.
Isn't that so weird?
Interesting.
What's going on there, Angels in America? What do you think? What's the deal?
Well, I think that makes sense because even though Lewis is trying so hard to like escape and self-destruct and get away, he can't help but think about Pryor and what's going on with Pryor. So
makes sense.
That makes sense to me.
It just didn't look like that at all. I was really surprised. Yeah. But yeah, this scene with Roy and Joe, where Roy is basically like in a way grooming Joe to be like, hey, you can continue to compartmentalize. What did you think about this? Or can you also sort of like summarize this scene? Because I had trouble parsing the sort of message of this whole scene.
Yeah, so Joe and Roy, Roy is trying to get Joe to move to DC and become part of the Justice Department. And Roy's he's been saying since the first episode, I can pull some strings and get you this job. And the thing that's been getting in Joe's way is Harper doesn't want to move to DC. In the first episode, she calls it like a giant graveyard, basically. Mm-hmm. And she's like, I don't want to live there. That's what a terrible place. And Joe is like, no, it's great. Reagan has brought light to America, and I want to be a part of something and making the world a better place, and da-da-da-da-da. So he has this very idealistic notion of what it would mean to be a part of the administration. So Roy is trying to get him to talk about, like what's standing in your way and keeping you from going to DC. Joe talks about his connection to his wife and why he fell in love with her, which we talked about in the first half, and which I thought was really special. That they're that the show is talking about, like, it's not as if Joe doesn't love her and was like pretending to love her or something. He clearly loves her in a very particular way and is like, he calls her buddy and says like, you're still my best buddy. Like, he cares about her a lot and feels a connection to her and a need to be connected to her. But it's just this sad thing of like, at the end of the day, you can't be live-in best buddies with someone that you're not sexually attracted to, because like sexuality is a core part of what it means to be a human being. And like, you need that. You need to be with someone who you can connect to in that way.
It's the same thing as the whole, talking about that Crossfire interview again. Like, why don't they just not have sex? Why not just try abstinence? And it's like, that doesn't work. That's not how humans work.
Yeah, right.
That's not how all humans work, obviously. Our shout out to our Ace fans out there, but like, still.
True. That's a good point. And I apologize for the way that I presented that. But so Joe's like trying to piece together this stuff and talk about himself. And every moment that Roy Cohn thinks Joe is going to say, like, by the way, I'm gay, he kind of like pushes his hand a little further onto Joe's back and is like, oh, you have a secret, huh? Like, what's your secret? And Al Pacino plays this so well. This like, almost like a dripping affection that he has for Joe, and like obsession that he has for, it's just so like, it's like, the way that he's just like putting his hands all over him and stuff. He plays it really well. And then he starts talking to Joe. He tries to get Joe to go to DC and tries to butter him up by talking about like how good of a son he is. And like, all these people are trying to be fathers, but like sometimes you need to be a good son or whatever. And it's like, what are you doing there, Al Pacino?
The best thing you can be, Joe, is a good son.
Yeah. And so, yeah, he is, I think grooming is a good word for it. Like, he's trying to basically create this relationship between himself and Joe, where Joe is like dependent upon him and idolizes him. And it's like this really, it's this really upsetting way that Roy Cohn, like, thinks he can find love in the form of sort of shaping someone to unquestioningly adore him and like follow his advice and all of that, while at the same time he's giving Joe this advice of like, you should just do what you want to do and like follow your ambitions and don't worry about what other people want. Just like do that thing for you. So that's kind of what the scene ends up being all about, is Roy trying to convince Joe, like, just go to DC because it's good for your career and it's what you want to do. And also it'll make me happy. And you want to make me happy, don't you? Isn't that what we got going on here?
Right. Yeah. It's a really intense power dynamic going on here. It's like reflecting the first scene with the two of them. And Joe looking at Roy and being like, I could do that. And Roy being like, yeah, you totally can. Like the devil whispering in his ear. Let her live the life she wants to live. Be your own person. And this is advice that could be interpreted in a lot of ways, but is definitely like self-serving on Roy's part.
Oh, yeah.
Which is what makes it so dangerous.
Oh, yeah. And
when they go outside and they're like drunk and he's touching him and he's saying, whatever you're capable of, let nothing stand in your way. Like, just do the thing. And then like later when they're at the dinner with the like spooky Republican guy and you see his power play of being like, all right, Joe, and now you're going to say yes. You're going to go to DC. Now, here you go. Here's the part where you say you're going. Now say it.
Well, and his other power play of telling that guy to rub his back in the middle of the restaurant.
Oh, it's so good. Incredible.
And then, being like, I'm going to hold my breath until you say yes and all this. Yeah, that scene was so well done and really gross, too. Where the spooky Republican guy is like, yeah, we're going to have Republicans in the presidency till 2000. And we're going to plant justices all over the federal bench. And you're sitting at home like, no, that's happening. This is real life. Stop it.
It's really the end of liberalism, Joe.
Yeah.
The end of New Deal socialism. The end of ipso facto secular humanism.
Sucks. And they're like, the Bolsheviks, FDR. And Joe's like, ha, totally.
Okay.
But what I really loved about that dinner scene is the way that it wakes Joe up to the real world to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Because Roy Cohn basically tries to get him into this sort of quid pro quo deal where he's like, okay, I'll get you this job. And then you have to make sure that this disbarment suit that's being carried out against me because I stole money from a client disappears and I can keep my my certification or whatever it is to stay a lawyer. And this is where Joe realizes like, oh, the Reagan administration isn't full of nice people trying to do the right thing. This is actually very gross and disgusting and not what I thought it was going to be. And I think it's when Joe realizes, like, if I continue to compartmentalize and deny who I am and try to kill myself from the inside out, I'm going to become Roy Cohn, someone who is like completely dead inside and is ravenously trying to hold on to this thing, his status as a lawyer, as like the only thing that he has left. Like that's what you get if you believe Roy Cohn's vision of I need to just go do what I feel like doing and follow my ambitions and play the game, is you end up denying who you are and becoming this like weird shell of a person who isn't happy, who isn't like loved. And the only thing that he has is this marker of status that is going to be stripped away from him.
It's everything about the power dynamics of that scene. And like, this is a hollow man. This is a man who at the end of it says, this is intestinal, Joe.
Yeah.
Like this is like fundamental to us.
Yeah.
And you have to imagine that him and the Republican guy are like, they've had some sort of like relationship before, because Roy in the first episode tells his doctor, like, the power that makes me different from homosexual men is I don't, just have sex with gay men. I bring them to the White House and we shake hands with the president and nobody knows. And that's what makes me powerful, is that I can do it and no one knows. And no one can stop me. It's honestly not surprising to me that Roy Cohn was a mentor to Donald Trump, because there are scenes like this where it's like, he just likes doing things because he can say he did them.
Yeah.
And I think that was unfortunately a really common thing in the Trump administration, was like, yeah, I did it. I said I would build a wall and we started one. It went terribly, but I told you I would do it and I did it.
Yeah.
Not to just like say that they're one-to-one parallels, obviously, but...
Well, but I think it's accurate because they're both characters who are obsessed with this very thin veneer of success. Almost like a gilding, like a thin gold layer of
like a Ferrero Rocher chocolate.
Right. Like for Trump, it's like this big building has my name on it, and so therefore I'm a successful man. And for Roy Cohn, it's like the label that people ascribe to me is not homosexual, it's lawyer. And so therefore like I have this status that I feel like I need to feel like I'm a man or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's that one of the most the most buck wild scenes in the episode. It's just the guy giving him a back rub. And he's like, yeah, the socialists, they're all alike, and we're finally past that. And then the guy's like, he's a hero. This guy right here is a hero of the right, Joe. You got to put your eggs in this guy's basket. And it's like, this is what you get. This is what you get for turning into a Roycone, is you get people giving you empty massages and backdoor deals.
And that tight close-up on Al Pacino was, I think,
so tight.
The best moment of him so far in these 2 episodes.
Uh-huh.
The part where
by the time he's saying this is intestinal, by the time we're like in his eyes.
Yeah, he's like, this is red meat. This is like, this is, what did he say? He's like, this is shit or whatever. I don't remember.
Yeah.
This is a bowel movement. And again, that's
they
another
want
line.
blood.
Yeah, that's another line where you're like, I never expected someone saying bowel movement to be so like, disturbing.
I think my favorite scene of both of these episodes, I think, is the next scene in the park with Joe and Lewis.
Yeah.
Because it's again, really, really honest. Like, these are characters who can just say their things to each other. And like any good scene, it starts with people eating. Joe comes to this park bench with not 1, not 2, but 3 hot dogs. And Lewis is like, why are you eating those? They're full of rat poop and like, it's horrible for you. And he's like, well, maybe sometimes I just want to be self-destructive. And then he one-ups him, and Lewis is like, cool, I want to kill myself. Anyways, let's talk about ourselves and what's eating away at us.
Also, there's that moment of like phallic imagery when Joe asks Lewis something and then shoves a hot dog in his mouth, and Lewis is like, but what? Sorry? I got distracted there for a second or whatever.
And he's like, don't you like these? He's like, yeah, I eat them, but only for the shape of it. Like, duh, that's what I do.
Yeah.
And Joe is like the sort of symbolic intent here, where Joe is like ingesting unhealthy food and then washing it down with unhealthy soda, and then trying to prevent this from destroying his stomach by chugging Pepto-Bismol is godlike.
Yeah.
Whoever directed this, the Mike Nichols work on this is stupendous. Whoever chose those like collections of imagery. Oh my God. Because it's him, like, again, he's like, oh, I can just choke it down. I can just wash down, all of these negative thoughts and feelings I have, and then they go away. I just drink Pepto-Bismol, and then I don't feel sick anymore. And it's like, no, you don't. You're going to fucking vomit everywhere.
Well, it's also telling that he follows the Pepto-Bismol with Coke. Like, he still returns to the, like, self-destructiveness.
Yeah, I'm not going to stop doing this. This could be as simple as not having the hot dog or having 1 hot dog, but no, I'm going to just triple down on this. They talk about Ron Reagan Jr., which was hilarious to me. Because Lewis is like, he's probably gay, and he's like, and then Joe's like, no, you can't assume things about people. And it's like, well, if you're the son of like this family who clearly show no love for each other in any of the interviews they have, then like you're gonna have a fucked up relationship to your family and your dad and what the American ideals are. He says, how would you feel if you had the American animus as your dad? Which is an incredible. Also, for what it's worth, Ron Reagan Jr. Is an atheist. Like a well-publicized atheist.
Oh, yeah, I think I knew that at some point.
Which is awesome. Yeah, what's it like to be the child of the zeitgeist, is what Lewis also says. And then Joe has this amazing thing that I referenced earlier, where he talks about how he came into work one day when it wasn't, there was nobody there. And he says, what if everything you owed everything to, justice or love or all of that, had just gone away? And how beautiful that would be.
Yeah.
And how freeing that would be. I think he calls it heartless terror, which is like, there's so many lines in this that make me like, sometimes when you hear good writing, you're like, fuck, I wish I wrote that. Or like, someone wrote that? Like, are you kidding? And I had a lot of those in my notes that I couldn't even bring up because there's just so many. Like, this series is dense with like poetic imagery in each line.
Yeah.
Especially with all the angel stuff, but that scene was fantastic. I don't even remember how that like wraps up exactly, but
I don't remember either. Yeah.
It's good stuff. And then cry number 3. So cry number 2 was him saying the Justice Department is empty. Cry number 1 is that he wishes to be destroyed by God. Cry number 3, late at night, Joe is in Central Park. It's like 4 a.m.
Yeah.
And he calls his mother. She says, why are you out on the street at 4 a.m? Are you drunk? And he's like, yes. And she's like, I don't care about the rest of what you're saying. Being drunk is a sin. Anyways, what do you want? And he's like, Mom, I'm gay. And she's like, you're drunk. And he's like, Mom, I'm trying to basically saying like, I'm trying to tell you something really profound about myself. And she's like, no, you're not. And he's like, did Dad ever love me? And I think she says, as an adult now, you should know by now that your dad didn't love you.
Yeah, she says, you're old enough to understand your father didn't love you without being ridiculous about it.
Are you fucking kidding me?
Well, and I think what's so funny and like important about when she says that is that's where he starts. He starts with that question of like, did Dad love me? Because
before he comes out.
Because it's been in his head since that conversation with Roy Cohn, where Roy Cohn is like, you're a good son. And he's like, no, actually my dad and I had a bad relationship, basically. And I think it's him really questioning this whole concept that Roy Cohn is outlining for him, and this whole very like Reagan era idea of like the nuclear family and this patriarch and all that. Joe's really questioning those things and asking his mom like, okay, this whole worldview that's going to buy me into going to Washington that made me a Republican, whatever, is it accurate? And she ignores it. And then he's like, by the way, I'm gay, and sometimes I come to Central Park to like watch people have sex. And she completely ignores that and says, well, of course your dad didn't love you. Anyway, go home.
I was like heaving crying because Joe's crying too. And this is Meryl Streep again coming back. So maybe bringing up the question of like, are these characters who are recurring supposed to be the angels? And if so, are they always good angels? Because here she's not being supportive at all. She's just a character in the universe. Yeah. And the last thing she says to him is drinking is a sin. And then hangs up the phone on him. I raised you better than that. And then hangs up the phone on him. Like, I am happy to have supportive parents who have never been this specifically cruel. But there's just a particular way that like parents can be mean to their children that really F's me up. Yeah. And this was a great example of it where it's like, I need someone to talk to. And my whole life you've told me that you were the person to talk to. But because you don't like this message or you don't want to hear it, I suddenly feel at a loss. Like I can't say anything to you. And that distance of like that happens to a lot of people when they get older, you know?
Yeah.
It's very tough. And then, as you had mentioned before, we get the climactic scene where Pryor Walter's watching Reagan's inauguration. Yeah. And they have their whole fight. And meanwhile, Joe and Harper are having their conversation where she's walking out on him, but he's like, no, but I'm walking out. And then finally, Mr. Lies, she goes, Mr. Lies, get me away from here. And he's like, yo, you rang? What's up? And like, the cutting back and forth to Pryor screaming. I like that. Were none of the nurses like coming to help him? There was like a significant period of time of him yelling where nobody like comes to help out. Yeah. She goes into the kitchen. Mr. Lies is there. There's like snow out of the kitchen. And she's like, I want to go away. I can't look at Joe anymore. And he goes, let's go. And then he walks her into the fridge, bringing us to full like Gabriel Garcia Marquez magical realism world.
Yeah. This scene, I think for me, Harper is the character that I like feel for the most. I think I feel for all of these characters to a certain extent, but just how horribly difficult this is for her to know what the truth is and to pull it out of Joe because she knows that like he needs to be honest in order to be a whole person. But then in the process of that, he's like, okay, can we talk? And she says, we are talking, aren't we? Now please shut up. And then when he keeps talking and he's like, I don't think I was ever sexually attracted to you and all that stuff, she says, oh, this is so scary. I want this to stop. Yeah. It's so heartbreaking to watch that happen to her.
And I don't know where you're supposed to draw the line of reality with her going to be with Mr. Lies. Like, where could they be going? But in a way, this is also just her, like, not wanting to accept things as they are right now. This is like a somewhat version of avoidance. Yeah. So I'm very, very curious, like, where this ends up. But I was once again brought to tears by this episode.
The other
and it's gonna happen again. Sorry.
The other thing that comes up in that conversation between Joe and Harper that I'm interested to learn more about is in the first episode she talks about how she's afraid to go into the bedroom because she always hears like there's a man with a knife in there. Hiding in there, and she can only go in there when Joe goes in with her. And then Joe says, like, I've figured out who the man is. It's me. And then she's like, oh, I recognize you. It is you. And I don't know about that.
What's going on there?
I don't know if it is Joe. I think they'll probably address that further. And I think that there is something to this idea that, like, Joe's self-destruction has had ramifications on Harper as well. But I feel like it's more complex than that also.
Yeah, exactly.
But we'll see.
It's a nice sort of like closing out of something that they brought up in episode 1. That she's like, oh, I don't want to move from here yet because I'm painting the other room. And he's like, you've been painting the room for a year. And she's like, yeah, because I can't do it alone because I'm afraid of the man over there. And for that little line to loop back around, and he's like, yeah, the man is me and you're afraid of me, I think is like good on paper, but it's like, okay, what does that mean exactly for them, relationship wise?
Right.
Well, that's episode 2. Smiles, we're having fun, we're enjoying it. I mean, I am really enjoying it, to be very real.
But it's a really beautiful show.
I still have the scene. There was like a famous scene from the end of the series that I've seen like a thumbnail of on YouTube, and I really am curious to get there and have all the context and be like, because I just watched it out of context and it was like a nice speech or something. That's something that's in the back of my brain.
Gotcha.
Let's talk about what's in the back of this episode. Tell me what we're watching next time on Angels and Chatz America, please.
So I'm pulling these summaries from HBO's website. Next time, we are watching the third part of Millennium Approaches, and then the first chapter of the second half, Perestroika. So first, in that third part of Millennium Approaches, Pryor is visited by spectral namesake ancestors who herald the arrival of the messenger. Which we didn't talk about that scene where Pryor's in the hospital bed, and it like zooms out into outer space, and the angel is saying like all this wild shit.
It's so weird. I can't even start to process it yet, to be honest with you.
Yeah, same. And then it zooms back to him, and he's like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
But
he is us in that moment.
That'll be more of a thing, I guess. Pryor is visited by spectral namesake ancestors who herald the arrival of the messenger. Roy is visited by the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg.
Whoa.
That's the character reveal that I spoiled for myself earlier that I told you about.
That's sick. If it's played by Emma Thompson, I'm leaving.
It's not. It's played by...
Okay.
It's played by Meryl Streep.
Oh, shit.
And then we have the first part of Perestroika. Well,
Okay.
While... hold on.
Am I about to get a huge spoiler?
I don't think these are spoilers, but I also don't know if you want to know this.
Okay. That's fine. Because I know Perestroika is the jump, so I don't want to... Maybe I don't want to know that.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to read this one, but people can read that.
Okay.
The plots continue. I'll say that.
Things continue to get better and worse. Mostly worse.
Yeah.
Great. Groovy. Now, Magellan, it's time for the plug zone. Everyone's favorite part of the podcast.
Yes. Do you want me to do the plugs?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't lob that to you whatsoever.
It's okay. You can get in touch with the show in a couple of different ways. We have an email address, chatspod@gmail.com, and a Twitter account, twitter.com/chatspod. You can also join fellow listeners in watching old seasons of Chatz over on the subreddit, reddit.com/r/chatspod. We're currently in the middle of our rewatch of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So that's fun. Our third season.
Wait, are we still in that?
Yeah.
Okay. That would make sense, right? Yeah.
You can also support the show in a couple of ways. You can do so by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast. You can do it by sharing this podcast with friends or your own online communities. And if you would like, you can support the show with your dollars over at patreon.com/chatspod, where with $1 a month, that's you saying, thanks, guys, keep doing your thing. $3 a month, you get access to thrice monthly bonus content. $5 a month is the bonus content and a big extra thanks, just because you feel like giving us a couple extra bucks. You can catch us every once in a while over on Twitch at twitch.tv/chatspod, where we do games and we do things like learning Klingon and stuff like that. So it's a fun time. Mm-hmm. I think those are all the plugs. And then, yeah. It's the end of May, so on the Patreon this month, you would have heard a pilot chats of The Mandalorian, a pilot chats of a few shows that ABC canceled in 2016, and then chats nights that I don't know what it's about because we haven't figured that out yet, but it was probably fun. I hope it was fun. And that's that. Alan, do you have a chatsome, a little pop culture experience or just thing that people can do between now and next time?
Golly, Magellan, I really do.
Yeah.
I prepared something for the class. Specifically, I've been really enjoying. So I know I've talked before about how one of my sort of private hobbies is Formula One. I watch Formula One week by week, and one of the best ways to get into Formula One, if you've never heard of it or are not familiar with the current state of it, is this Netflix documentary series that just got its third season this year. It's called Drive to Survive. And it's a really well done, basically Netflix original series where they focus on, in the first season, all the different drivers, in the second season, all the teams, and in the third season, all of the races of each of those seasons. They do a season of a show every season of racing. And Formula One is such a fascinating thing because it's a combination of like old British motor racing politics and companies and the way that capitalism can like infect competition and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. There are lots of characters to love and appreciate in these stories, but these are also real people. So, you know, if I have an interesting criticism of it that might entice people, it's that you will learn to love these people and then look them up and be like, wait, that like wacky dude also has stake in like some horrible business in Germany. That's so crazy. Mm-hmm. You'll learn a lot. You get to see really great shots of the races. If you just like watching motor racing, it's really well done. And there's some good interviews in there.
Nice.
It's entertaining. And if you've never ever, again, if you've never watched Formula One, just pop on season 1 or even season 3. They're all per the season that they are about. Mm-hmm. You'll have a great time and learn a whole lot about a really cool sport.
Nice.
Yeah, that's what I got. What about you, Magellan?
So I have a couple things to share. First of all, just a personal plug, because I don't think this would have been mentioned on any episodes so far since we're recording a little ahead, is I'm now on another podcast, a monthly video game podcast called Super Smash Echoes, where myself and my friend and former Chatz guest, Justin, talk about one video game a month that represents a franchise that's a part of Super Smash Brothers. So back at the end of March, we did Super Mario Bros. 3. At the end of April, we did Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. And here at the end of May, we're going to be talking about Majora's Mask in like maybe a week or so. So that's pretty fun, right?
Right.
Yeah. Let's see. And then in terms of chatsoms related to Angels in America, I would really recommend that people go watch How to Survive a Plague. It's a really great documentary. And I heard about it initially from an episode of a show that I've chatsomed before called Know Your Enemy, which is this like leftist thinking about conservatism podcast. And they have an episode where they interview Peter Staley and talk about how the AIDS epidemic and ACT UP and all that relates to COVID. And they get Peter Staley's perspective on Anthony Fauci and his role in the AIDS epidemic and how that informed his response to COVID. And I think that, we owe a lot more than maybe we're consciously aware of to AIDS activists when it comes to like how people like Fauci have pushed for and tried to respond to COVID. And I think being aware of that legacy is really important. So I'd recommend watching that documentary and listening to that podcast episode. And then in terms of like a fun chatsome, I mean, those are fun, but like a turn off your brain kind of chatsome. I've been getting really into the whole expanded Rhett and Link universe, the Good Mythical Morning situation, their Mythical Kitchen channel. And the Mythical Kitchen channel has a podcast called A Hot Dog is a Sandwich, where they just have like food debates. And that's a really fun one. I would broadly recommend all of the mythical stuff, but I think that's a good podcast to add to your rotation.
A hot dog is a sandwich.
Yeah. Oh, and also on Red and Link's podcast, Ear Biscuits, you kind of have to like those guys, I think, to listen to their podcast. So it's, to each their own. But they have these 2 episodes where Red and Link separately talk about their experience going from being like very devout evangelical Christians to being agnostic. And if you're interested in religion and faith and agnosticism and that sort of stuff like I am, those 2 episodes were really, really interesting, and I would encourage people to check them out. So those are my recs.
Those are some fantastic recs, Magellan.
Thanks.
Thank you for providing them.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Angels and Chatz America. Thank you to Magellan for being the rock to my hard place, and thank you for listening to this episode of Chatz. Peace.